The Kena Upanishad is taking us from our normal mental life to the divine life. And it provokes the change by asking 4 questions. By whom missioned falls the mind shot to its mark? By whom yoked moves the first life breath on its paths? By whom impelled is this word that men speak? What God set eye and ear to their workings? And then it begins to answer the questions. That which is hearing of our hearing, mind of our mind, speech of our speech, that too is life of our life breath and sight of our sight. The wise are released beyond and they pass from this world and become immortal. There sight travels not, nor speech, nor mind. We know it not, nor can distinguish how we should teach of it, for it is other than the known. It is there, above the unknown. It is so we have heard from men of old who declared that to our understanding. Now in these replies it is pointing to that of which we cannot speak, which is the hearing of our hearing, speech of our speech, sight of our sight, mind of our mind. That is beyond even the unknown, and it is not the known. And having placed this before us, it now gives us, continuing the same line of discussion, 5 entry points in our own human experience. By dwelling on each of these 5 entry points and pursuing it to its source, we can get to the experience of that which we cannot teach, it says. And yet we can get to realize it and know it. And these 5 entry points are, as in a sense, a continuation of the questions it raised before. First, that which is unexpressed by the word, that by which the word is expressed. Know that to be the Brahman and not this which men follow after here. And the word we have seen in Sri Aurobindo's commentary is not only our physical speech, but the entire act of manifesting an experience, an idea, a consciousness, a potential, a pure essential truth, moving to take on form and express. Whether through thought, whether through action, whether through emotion, or through physical speech. The origin of it is there in the original creative power, in the original conception of the divine by which it creates and forms the whole universe. That is reflected in our speech and our creative action, indirectly, through many layers. And what we have here is a very crude, superficial imitation of something which is Brahman. To realize that by going back through this whole idea of how do we express, how do we create, where does it come from, and we go backward until we enter that. Next, that which thinks not by the mind, or that which one thinks not with the mind, both meanings are there. That which thinks not by the mind, that by which the mind is thought, know that to be the Brahman and not this which men follow after here. And our power of conception, power of thinking, power of even rationality, logic, understanding, implies something else behind which knows all things in right relation. And so if we step back from the mind's operations and look at something more fundamental which makes possible the mind's working, we awaken into a supra-mental consciousness. Next, that which sees not with the eye. Also one can read, that which one sees not with the eye. But that which sees not with the eye, that by which one sees the eyes seeing, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. This meaning this seeing. And the next one, that which hears not with the ear, or that which you cannot hear with the ear. It has double meaning. That by which the ear's hearing is heard, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after here. And this is the theme of the previous and the current chapter, which we are coming to a close rapidly. And the next, which will be the theme of the next chapter, is the life breath. That which breathes not with the breath, that by which the life breath is led forward in its paths. Know that to be the Brahman. And so it is as if a culmination. First, the entire creative process is taken all the way to the divine creative process, and we see how different it is from our creative process. Our mind is raised to a divine mind, our senses are raised to the divine senses, and then our life itself, our existence, our experience of the world is raised to the divine life. And that will be the theme of the next chapter. And so we are raised step by step through this process of the introspection to the realization of the life of the divine, which is intended for us here on earth, even in a human body. This being the big picture, the current chapter of Sri Aurobindo's commentary focuses on the divine sense. And we have seen, in summary, that our power of senses is not really a biological function, but a power of the mind. Because mind separate from body can project itself and see, hear and think, see, hear, taste, smell, etc. And here in our biology, it has only organized on a biological basis as physical support for physical perception, sound, sense, taste, etc. But where does this power of mind, having 5 senses, come from? And Sri Aurobindo has gone a step further. Behind the physical senses, behind even the inner senses and the mind senses, there is the pure consciousness of the divine, which is one with the whole universe, and it knows the entire universe from its oneness consciousness, because it is in each thing, because it forms each thing. It knows each thing from inside, and as it meets it from outside, it knows from outside what it already knew from within. In a sense, as an analogy, if in the middle of sleep you have a mosquito which is biting you on, let's say, your left hand, with your eyes still closed, with no other sense, your right hand moves, knows exactly where to hit, it knows exactly where the left hand is, and it hits right there. How did I know where my left hand was? I didn't have to look. I know because inside I am my left hand. Outside I am my right hand, and I can bring them together. And when I meet, I know the outside touch because I know already from inside what it is. And so in the divine sense, all is known even as you look from outside, even as you hear from outside. Divine consciousness sees, hears, knows, because it is already that which it is meeting from outside. Yet there are 5 senses. And Sri Aurobindo took us through a very detailed exposition how the one consciousness moves to create form through 5 different operations of force, which is broadly described as the 5 elemental states, and we have discussed in great detail. So when now the divine consciousness looks at itself, it sees it in a 5-fold perception. It senses in a 5-fold perception corresponding to these 5 workings of its own force. And so we have now some sense of how the divine experiences. In the last portion, Sri Aurobindo described how each of these 5 senses is working inside the others. He took the example of the hearing, and we saw how within the hearing there is an essential sense of touch, of form, of smell, of taste. And the same happens with each of the other senses. Even as we look with the eyes, in the eyes seeing, there is a sense of touch. It goes both ways. Not only when you look at something carefully, you have the sense of touching, but if somebody else observes you, you have also the sense of being violated, as if somebody reaches out and touches you with their sight. And so on with each of the other four senses. And then preparing us for a glimpse of how the divine sees the world, himself as world. He says, if we consider these things thus subtly in the light of our own deeper psychology and pursue them beyond physical appearances by which they are covered, we shall get to some intellectual conception of the sense behind our senses, or rather the sense of our senses, the sight of our sight, and the hearing of our hearing. The Brahman. But this Brahman, Sri Aurobindo points out, is not Brahman in the absolute withdrawing. It is Brahman as the absolute turning to look upon the universe, its own relativities, and taking it into itself through its absolute sense, its fivefold divine sense. It is the Lord, the Master Soul, the governing transcendent, the All, who constitutes and controls the action of the gods on the different planes of our being, and of course in the cosmos. And he says, since it constitutes all this working, all our subtle sight and physical sight is at best a shadow of the divine sense. And then, the last sentence we read last time, nor is that divine sight and hearing limited to things physical, but extend themselves to all forms and operations of conscious being. So when the divine sees, hears, smells, tastes, touches, it is not only things physical, but everything else which we do not see, smell, touch, all the domains and levels of consciousness, it embraces them all simultaneously. Now, this is where we paused last time. We come now to the last two paragraphs where he takes this glimpse that we are having through the mind to its highest possibility. The supreme consciousness does not depend on what we call sight and hearing for its own essential seeing and audition. It operates by a supreme sense, capital S, creative and comprehensive, of which our physical and psychical sight and hearing are external results and partial operations. So when the supreme consciousness sees and hears, does not need any physical organs, obviously not even subtle organs. It sees directly, consciousness meeting consciousness, itself meeting itself, entirely, transparently, nothing conceals, because it is everything. As I can feel all of my palm, even if you cover it, I still know it. It knows itself as its own body. But he uses two words, creative and comprehensive. When it sees, unlike our seeing, which is only registering what already exists, its seeing creates what it sees. A sense of this we have in our dream state. In the subtle body, sometimes as you walk, you suddenly realize you don't need to walk. You can will yourself and you float up. Equally, you see a wall and you will the wall should not be there, and the wall is gone. You see the waters and you wonder, oh, where is the boat? And there the boat has become. The very act of choosing to want to have an experience creates that experience. In the mind's operations of pure thought, something similar happens. As you think out something, your very act of thinking is creating what you think out. The creating and the perceiving are not two separate operations. In the physical world, I built a device and I placed it before you for you to see. But in the pure mind, as you think out an idea, not only you're perceiving the idea, but you're formulating it at the same time. The two operations are one. And when the divine looks upon his universe, As he looks, he as much creates as he perceives through all five operations, through all five senses. And remember, the five senses correspond to five workings of pure force, which we discussed earlier. It's as if as he looks upon it, all these workings begin to move and take on the forms, perceived at the same time. The creating and seeing are one operation. And that is why in the Vedic vocabulary, the power of sight or the power of the word and so on do not have the same value as for us. They are creative powers. You literally create reality as you turn to perceive it in that higher station. So, it operates by supreme sense, creative and comprehensive. Not only as it creates, it doesn't create a piece. As it forms in the whole and knows and holds the whole. We may take the analogy again of a dancer who is expressing through body movements a certain sentiment. And as the dancer raises a hand to point, it is not just the finger which goes like that, the entire body moves. The entire body moves from the feet, the waist, the arm, and the fingertip moves. And in that single movement, the goal is still this pointing, but the whole body supports and participates. And so in the divine perception, which is in a consciousness indivisible, which is a consciousness infinite and all-inclusive, as it sees this flower growing out of the tree, smells, tastes, touches, tastes, as it perceives this flower, it is the whole universe which is leaning to form and become the flower, and the entire divine consciousness which sees and knows this flower not only as an expression of the whole universe, but through the flower glimpses behind it the entire universe peeking out. That is why comprehensive. So when you turn and you see the bird flying, in the bird's flight is the entire universe leaning inside and expressing itself in this flight. A little seashell that your foot almost stepped upon, and the entire universe is held in it, expressing itself through it. And so there are two movements. One is the whole universe moving to form, and the whole universe revealing itself in this, through this special front and face. And so the supreme sense, creative and comprehensive, of which our physical and psychical, that is the subtle, sight and hearing are external results and partial operations. Now you can see how to something so massive, so complete, this is such a small piece and superficial imitation. But then we would say, it doesn't need this. Yes, it doesn't need. Does it use this at all, the human experience? He explains, neither is it ignorant of these, nor excludes them. It knows, because it knows essentially each creature, each being. It knows also how that creature experiences the universe through its senses. And it knows, includes them in its overall seeing. For since it constitutes and controls, it must be aware of them, but from a supreme plane, Param Dhama, which includes all in its view. Now, let us dwell on this idea for a while. From that supreme plane, all creatures, all beings, all objects are known intimately from inside as your own body, forms of your own unit, oneness body. And each of these creatures that experiences the universe from its limited perspective is included in that experience. So briefly pause now. Consider just the earth. 6 billion human beings and their experience of life. All of their life experience is included in this vision. And consider all the trillions of creatures, animals, birds, insects, bacteria, and their experience of the world and the universe. And each of their perceptions and experiences is included in this. What would you describe such an experience as? Already within us there is an image forming 1,000 eyes. In the Veda, this image forms, which becomes in the Puranic tradition a description of Indra. Indra, as the divine mind, has 1,000 eyes. What do you mean by that? Because he's seeing everything, knowing everything from all directions, from all angles at the same time. But remember, the divine is not limited to only the physical being's perceptions. Now include all the trillions or centillions of subtle beings on the subtle levels and their experiences and perceptions. And all of these are now included in that whole seeing. And finally, above all that, in its highest poise, every point of space and time looking out on the whole universe, infinite, eternal. That seeing, that hearing, that sensation is included. Because all is his consciousness. Even empty space is his consciousness, representing itself as emptiness. Even as hard granite is his consciousness, representing itself as a resistant substance. All being himself from each single point in all space and across all time simultaneously, he is and senses in all 5 operations the whole of the infinite and eternal universe. How do you describe such an experience? The mind boggles, the mind is astounded, it is stupefied. But here we get a glimpse of how the divine sees and knows. In that consciousness, the human experience or the experience through the 5 physical senses or even the 5 subtle senses of a subtle being are such tiny trivialities seen from our sight. But to his sight, each of them is himself seeing entirely with self-imposed limitations. When, for example, the divine sees through the human eyes do not see what is behind the wall. But the divine sense not only sees, knows it is what is behind, but in the human sight's working, it chooses to not see, and therefore allowing a human sight perception. But in its subtler levels, in its highest station, it knows and sees all things, even as it may choose to withhold what it experiences for purpose of the play. So, it must be aware of them, but from a supreme plane, Param Dhama, which includes all in its view. For its original action is that highest movement of Vishnu, which the Veda tells us the seers behold like an eye extended in heaven. So here comes another image from the Veda. Not 1,000 eyes, but it is one consciousness seeing and knowing, isn't it? So why divide it? It is in the Indra, which is the mind consciousness, that the division is operative. In its highest station, it is not 1,000 eyes, it is one eye. But one eye extended upon all, in all, present everywhere. But how do you represent that? And the only way you can represent it is an eye floating high above and looking down. And you've perhaps seen this symbol many times. It is present even in the Egyptian tradition. It is present in the modern occult societies in the West. It is present on the American dollar bill, where you will see a pyramid and on top there is this all-seeing eye. And its origin traces back to this original symbol in the Veda. That highest movement of Vishnu, which the Veda tells us the seers behold like an eye extended in heaven. When the great rishis look up and see that movement of Vishnu, they see it, perceive it as this great extended eye. In the Egyptian symbolism, you will see this eye present and with rays pointing downwards, suggesting its spread, its sight everywhere, and all workings below of the cosmos. Sometimes this sense of expansion and the cosmic consciousness is represented by extended wings around the central eye. There are wings extended which gently curl down as if reaching out to embrace the whole cosmos. But these are representations of our human perception of something which otherwise is so beyond our intellectual comprehension. And yet we are able to get a glimpse of it now in the way Sri Aurobindo leads us to it. And he says, it is that by which the soul sees its seeings and hears its hearings. What does it mean for the soul to see, for the soul to hear? Consider that the soul does not have physical organs. It doesn't have even subtle organs. It needs to take on a subtle body to have the full engagement with the subtle world, and it needs to take on a physical body to have a direct engagement with the physical world. How does the soul see? And how does it see itself and know itself? Its perception belongs to this consciousness. It is that by which the soul sees its seeings and hears its hearings. When we live our life, when we pass through various kinds of experiences, from crude to the refined to the most subtle, how is the soul seeing? It senses the vibrations directly. In those vibrations, it experiences a contact. In that contact, it experiences a perception of form. In that, it experiences a perception of smell and taste. But all of this is happening in that pure consciousness, registering in its essential sense. And at the same time, overlaying upon this, if the soul's presence within us is sufficiently awakened to the physical consciousness and the subtle consciousness, and they are turned to it, at the same time overlaid upon this perception of the soul are our subtle sight and our physical sight and senses simultaneously. And so when we look upon, let us say, a beautiful scene. On the top of one mountain, I see far off the pure, bare snow of the Himalayan peaks. And physically, yes, it's beautiful, but something deep within, at the level of the soul, feels its purity, feels that presence which we associate with Shiva. And we know that this is his residence. Why? Because this, in the physical domain, most easily supports that particular vibration which the soul perceives directly through and independent of our physical seeing. And in this way, simultaneously, there are many levels at which there is a perception. For those in whom the subtle sight has been opened, the clairvoyant sight, they may look at you as a physical body and see around you what they call the aura. And in the aura, they may describe this and that movement, their threads, their fibers, their colors. But actually, the seeing of the pure seeing of the subtle sight is not bound to the physical extension around you. And if you were to close your physical sight, you would still glimpse the same aura and perceive it directly, but now more free of the physical limitation of form. You would see it for what it is in the subtle levels. And if that also sight were to be closed, the pure seeing of the soul would see through. It's the reason why often when a person, often yogis, when they're required to see deeper, spontaneously their physical sight tends to close. And then the inner sight sees more directly. Or if still deeper and the soul seeing, then even the inner consciousness closes and you feel as if the person is withdrawn into trance. And then there is direct perception and direct action without the mixing of these layers. When sufficiently skilled, one would have all these simultaneously and would be able to differentiate without needing to close. But still, it is helpful for a special focus. It's the reason why you see the mother often, when she would meet with people, she would hold the hand and then her eyes would close and she would go into trance. And at that point, she would be plunging deep into you or working upon some obstruction or seeing your past and your future and rearranging things for a particular outcome. Or, if so it was necessary and the person was very receptive, she would look deep into your eyes and her consciousness would plunge straight through and penetrate deep inside. And the person in whom it happens would lose all sense of superficial perception. There would only be the direct experience of the consciousness. I have narrated before here the description I received from one such who had come and met the mother early on. He was barely in his early 20s. And it was just one meeting where he went, and he said, as she looked into my eyes, I felt this enormous love pouring into me. And I found myself being bounced around all over the universe. And so I asked him to describe, what was it? Can you describe what you mean by this bouncing around? And he said it was as if layer by layer something was being peeled off, and each layer was as vast as the universe, and with each peeling off it was as if I was going into something deeper and vaster across the entire universe. And all through there was this pouring pure love. And at the end of it, he was in a daze for 3 days. None of the outer functions were operative. The consciousness had been pushed to something vast, profound. And that experience had been brought forward, overwhelming all of the surface workings. Until eventually the experience receded and the normal surface workings began to come back, the mind began to think, the senses began to operate in their usual way. And then suddenly he had a problem. After this experience, what do I do with my life? He didn't know what to do. And so the rest of the story we need not get into. The mother herself, because she was open on all these levels, as necessary, she could focus. There's a description in the agenda. She describes a person who had passed away and how that person came to meet her with a family member. The soul came holding the hand of the family member when he came to meet the mother. And it was as if a form of protection for the soul to be with that family member. And she is here speaking to this family member, blessing them, but she is fully aware of that person in soul form, and she is equally in communication with him at the same time, on the subtle level where the soul can meet her in its vibrational level. In a letter, we have this comment that the mother makes during the Second World War. She says there are thousands of people that she, it is perhaps hundreds of people that she has to meet every day. And somebody writes to Sri Aurobindo and says, Mother says hundreds of people, but I don't see hundreds of people. I think the ashram community was a few hundred. And Sri Aurobindo responds there and explains that the mother is meeting not just the people who come to meet her physically, at the same time she is meeting many others who are meeting her on the subtle levels. And with each one she has to deal with full attention. So we, with our physical eyes, we see her physical body and we worry whether she didn't smile at me enough or not. When at the same time she is meeting several people on several levels and operating on each of them. And once in a while, because of a particular extreme situation, it was necessary for her to pause, withdraw, and enter into deep trance. Panditji describes how many times when she would be receiving money orders during the Second World War, she wanted to sign each one of them. Now consider how important that is for her. Some secretary could have received and signed. Why was she doing this? Because she was engaging with each person through the link of the money order and engaging with the money power equally upon the world. If there's a money order that comes, let's say at that time from London, and a money order which comes from Calcutta, through that link she is also acting upon the person, but also on those circumstances. And during the war it was especially important. And sometimes while she would sign, she would stop, the pen would stop, her eyes would close, and she would go into deep trance, and then she would come back and continue signing. And once in a while, Panditji narrates how she would comment, oh, there was a call from Greece or from some place, and she had to go and intervene. It It is that by which the soul sees its seeings and hears its hearings. But all sense only assumes its true value and attains to its absolute, its immortal reality. We cease to pursue the satisfactions of the mere external and physical senses, and go beyond even the psychical being to this spiritual or essential, which is the source and fountain, the knower, constituent, and true valuer of all the rest. So if not for this spiritual sense, the subtle sense and the physical sense would not exist, would not function. They are only reflections and reduced operations on lower levels of consciousness. And because that seeing and hearing of the soul takes place, therefore, these senses assume their true value. And they assume their true value, attain to their absolute and the immortal reality when we go to that and stop pursuing this. What is meant by true value? You look at a flower. I remember an example. Somebody brought a painting to my sister who's an artist. And he showed the painting. And my sister said, "Oh, this is so beautiful. This is so wonderful." And the man said, "Tell me, what is its price?" And my sister said, "No, but it is so precious. Look at this art. Look at this artistry." And I said, okay, but what is the price at which it will go?" He was a businessman with no sense of artistic sensitivity. The seeing was reduced to just the transactional value that he knew in his consciousness. To her, who was an artist, it was the intrinsic value of the art as perceived through human senses. And in that sense, if you look at it, how do you put a price? If I take it to a barbarian, the barbarian will say, this is a good painting, weighs so many kilos, so much wood, I can burn it and it will last me at least 1 hour. That is his value system. You take it to another artist, and he will say, "Oh, this is so valuable." You take it to another businessman who will say, "Right now nobody knows this artist. In 10 years that artist will be famous. I will pay you 1,000 rupees now, and in 10 years I will sell it for 1 million. That's its value." But if you ask the original artist who made it, he might just say, "I'm sorry, it is not for sale. It is infinite value." You know, Leonardo da Vinci, the Mona Lisa was one of his great creations. He refused to sell it. It was always carried with him, and he worked upon it often. And it was only after he passed away, many of such special paintings, that they became available for others. But to that artist who knows its value, it is infinite. In the true sight, the true perception, it's not just its transactional or superficial, even through the physical senses, superficial value, but what is the consciousness behind? When Mother worked with Huta to paint the Savitri paintings, she trained her from scratch. And it was very interesting. There's a whole story, but we don't have time for it. She said, "I tried with many artists. Some of them were great artists who had been trained in Shantiniketan and other places of world standard." And she said, "I couldn't do what I wanted because they were too formed." So she picked this young girl who had zero artistic ability at that point and trained her from scratch, from basic sketches, mixing colors and so on, and kept her in a very strict discipline pursuing the art. And one day, by mistake, Huta copied a picture from some magazine, and it was a beautiful picture. The moment it came before Mother was extremely upset, and she said with great force, "Where did you get this? Where has this come from? What is the source of this?" She got the vibration immediately. And Huta said, "Mother, I'm very sorry, I copied it from a magazine." And Mother said, "Immediately destroy. Never again you will do this." She wanted a purity of consciousness. She was building a link from her to Huta. She said, "I will paint through your hands." She wanted a purity of consciousness which nothing would sully. And she did it with Huta. And in the Savitri paintings in particular, she said each of the forms, the beings painted, is a conscious living being. And when you see those paintings, I would suggest those of you who have not seen it to go to Savitri Bhavan and see those paintings, especially the early ones. Sometimes the form is almost like a skilled child, not yet a master artist. The later ones are, of course, different. And if you can get out of the physical sight and physical form of appreciation and then see deeper, you will see each of them is a living being. And as a living being, it is a conscious soul and represents that particular quality of consciousness and power of the soul. And it is a useful exercise to do that. And Mother describes very interesting correspondences. She tells Huta at some point, she says, last night, all those beings came to me. All these paintings were kept in a box. And she said, all these beings came to me. And she describes what happened. And that's the reason why she never wanted those paintings to be used casually. None of them are to be used for book covers or visiting cards or even greeting cards. When they had to be shown all together in the exhibition. And everybody was asked to be present well before, that they would be centered to be able to receive what comes through the paintings, and taken out after that. And this very strictly were the instructions which Huta kept also after. And people who do not understand this, they say, what is this? Why are you so protective? Why don't you allow the paintings to be printed and published, distributed separately? And Mother said, no, they have to be together, because they are like a family. The whole of Savitri and the beings of the whole Savitri experience are together. And these things one begins to glimpse, one begins to perceive as those deeper dimensions awaken in us. And it is there that we have the real value of the painting. So it is that by which the soul sees its seeings and hears its hearings, but all sense only assumes its true value and attains to its absolute, its immortal reality, when we cease to pursue the satisfactions of the mere external and physical senses and go beyond even the psychical being to this spiritual or essential. So even the subtle sight is nothing compared to this. Now when we have discussed this, you will realize that occult sight, that capacity to see auras and see things of subtle worlds, it is as trivial and as crude in comparison to the soul's seeing as the physical seeing. Only you're seeing one level up. What's the big deal? It's like radio waves. You're listening to radio by tuning in. What's the big deal? You're operating on a level of the subtler vibrations of radio frequency. It's just another level of the same physical hearing or sight. But the true sight, the true seeing of the soul is this, which we must seek after, and not get bogged down with even the subtle powers, occult powers and occult perceptions. They are as useless or as limited as the physical. Yes, in their own way they have a value. If your physical sight could see very far, if it can see with clear focus, if it can hear subtle sounds, it's useful. But it is nothing compared to the true seeing and what it can bring into the physical sight or the occult sight. And so, to get to that true value, attain to absolute and the immortal reality, we have to go beyond the pursuit of satisfaction of mere external and physical senses, to this spiritual or essential, which is the source and the fountain. It is from there that the true seeing and all seeing comes. And fountain, because all other seeings are like the water. It comes out in the source, one stream, and then breaks up and breaks out into little drops. You can catch a drop and say, this is it. Or you can get to the fountain itself. Then you have it all. The knower, constituent and true valuer of all the rest of the seeings, perceptions of sense. That is what we have to seek after. And this is the profound meaning of this one sentence, which otherwise we would have just left in a superficial way. That which sees not with the eye, or that which the eye does not see. That which sees not with the eye, that by which one sees the eyes seeing, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after hear. That which hears not with the ear, and at the same time that which the ears do not hear. That by which the ear's hearing is heard, know that to be the Brahman, and not this which men follow after hear. And the last paragraph, Sri Aurobindo concludes, this spiritual sense of things, secret and superconscient in us, alone gives their being, worth and reality to the psychical and physical sense. This seeing is there in us. It's not as if something we have to develop or attain to in an artificial way. It is already there, but it is super conscient, not in the domain of our current consciousness. We have only to open our consciousness and enlarge it and ascend in it to be able to gain to that which is already there. It is secret. But it alone gives our psychical and physical senses their being, worth and reality. They can exist because that exists. They are valuable. The seeing is useful even because that exists. You can set a video camera, switch it on. It also is seeing. You can plug it to a computer and the computer records. So there's a seeing which is being recorded. What is its value? Its value is when I look through and I perceive, isn't it? When in looking I enjoy the seeing, when in hearing I enjoy and register the hearing. It's not being mechanically recorded and stored away. So the worth of it, that thing which is mechanically recorded, has no value until it is seen and perceived. Who is seeing it? What makes it worthwhile? Because the consciousness sees. Therefore it becomes worthwhile. And reality. It is real because it sees. Just as an analogy, I can create a daydream. I can create a picture, visualize in my mind some fantastic reality. What is its value? Unless the soul sees it and sees it as a real form of itself, it is just a phantasm, a fantasy. So that alone gives their being, worth and reality. Each of these is so important to the psychical and physical sense. In themselves they have none. You take out the soul's perception and you just have a machine which is recording mechanically the light falling on it. Or even that shuts down. There's no being, no worth, no reality. When we attain to it, these inferior operations are as it were taken up into it, and the whole world and everything in it changes to us and takes on a different and non-material value. So the two are not incompatible. As we ascend to that, all these lower operations, they are included in our personal experience. Now we are no more talking about how the divine sees. It is how we will see as we ascend in our consciousness to the supreme sense. And all our other inferior senses, physical and psychical, they will be as if woven in. I'm reminded of another example of the mother's seeing. We have mentioned how she spoke of the eyes behind her head. But this is a more direct example where narrated to us by a lady who was assisting the mother at the time when the mother went to play tennis in the tennis ground. And this lady noted over many days something and then asked the mother, "Mother, every time that you ask, who is that person? I notice that it is a woman." Mother would say, "Who is that person?" And this person would say, "It is and so." Mother would say, "Ah." Everyone else she wouldn't ask. But so after many weeks, this person asked the mother, "Mother, every time you ask who is that, it's a woman. Why is it?" And mother said, explained to her, and we have this on record, mother said, "When I look at a person, I don't just see the physical form, I see the whole being, meaning all the layers of the subtle and the soul and everything." And she said, as things are at that time, this was in the 50s, women were not allowed to develop their personality and individuality. And so the subtle individuality was not concretized, it was vague, unformed. And so I can't make out clearly who it is. And then she commented, but now that I am here, all this will change. And you can see how things have changed from the 50s to now. In barely one generation, the whole world saw a huge change. 2 generations down, men or women, you can see clear formed individualities, except where some spaces still things are under oppression and suppression of some kind. This was part of her work for the earth also, things which we would never know about if she didn't mention like this in passing. But this gives us a glimpse of how she saw a person. In the working of the subtle sight, and we are not even speaking here of the soul sight, when the higher ranges are operative, one sees not only the physical form, but layers and layers around, and sometimes large, going several meters around, and fine threads, fibers, colors in movement. And as the person engages with another person, these threads and colors move around, reaching out. And when that subtle sight is developed, you can see in a group, let's say in a room, we have a number of people having a party. A new person enters, a stranger enters, and you can see from that person extensions of consciousness reaching out, scanning the room as if touching each one and immediately connecting to some with whom the vibes are common, are in affinity. And then if you observe the physical person, he walks around and goes and meets those very people. Long before the surface personality is conscious of who is in the room, these subtler layers of our own subtle consciousness have already sensed, scanned and connected energetically to those with whom it has affinity. All the rest is just working out. But this is only on the subtle level. When you go to the soul level, it is more profound. You see there the whole of the past evolution of the soul and its future progression of its aspirations. And Mother describes this. She says, in the first meeting with people, and she wouldn't do it always after, in the first meeting she said she would see the entire journey of the soul and its future potential, and then she would go deep into the being, draw out the psychic being and give a push to its highest possibility. In some cases, as when Satprem first met her, she stood right there and stared at him an entire half hour. And he stood there equally and they stood like that. What she was seeing, what she was doing, unless she described, we would never know. But these are some glimpses we have of how such a consciousness sees. And we will see something shortly which gives us a further glimpse. So when we attain to it, the spiritual sense of things, these inferior operations are, as it were, taken up into it, and the whole world and everything in it changes to us and takes on a different and non-material value. And the material value is, of course, very easy to recognize, very crude in comparison to these. That master consciousness in us senses our sensations of objects, sees our seeings, hears our hearings, no longer for the benefit of the senses and their desires, but with the embrace of the self-existent bliss, which has no cause, beginning or end, eternal in its own immortality. So when thus we have ascended to the spiritual sense, that master consciousness in us now, it is seeing the cosmos in itself, in its totality, but now through this individual focus, it sees directly. And no longer for the benefit of the senses and their desires. Consider most of our senses are used because of some pull of desire or some push of instinct, and just for the satisfaction of the senses. So many artists speak of painting for the sake of art. But Mother says no. Paint for the sake of the divine. Art for the sake of art, they say. Mother says no. Art for the sake of the divine. That is what raises it to its highest possibility. But this should be true of everything, all our sense experience. You prepare food, that too should be not just for the satisfaction of the palate, but for the sake of the divine. And so for each thing we do or create. But not only we do it in that sense, we can begin to perceive it now with that perception. And what is that perception for the divine in its highest, when the divine himself sees through? With the embrace of the self-existent bliss. What was the source of this massive emergence of the cosmos from the oneness of the divine? It's bliss choosing to express itself. And that bliss is always there, always complete, and it moves to manifest its infinite potential. And that now self-existent bliss embraces all that it sees, all that it hears, all that it touches, tastes, smells as its own body. No cause, no beginning or end. The bliss simply is, and it relates to itself through these senses. Eternal in its own immortality. A consciousness which is immortal, eternal, meets itself in its infinity as a blissful contact of the divine bliss. And so this completes the chapter where Sri Aurobindo leads us to glimpse the sense of our sense, which is cause of hearing of our hearing and sight of our sight. And now with speech of our speech, mind of our mind, and sense of our sense, we are ready for the completion. What happens when all our expressions are a divine expression, when all our thinking is a supramental consciousness and all our senses are a supramental perception? We begin to live a divine life, a super life. And so the next chapter is titled The Super Life, Life of Our Life, which we will take up next Sunday. But for now, in completion of this discussion, there are 3 sonnets of Sri Aurobindo where he captures for us how the divine sense perceives. And the 3 separately look at divine sight, divine hearing, and divine sense in its essentiality. And so we will read from this and complete this chapter. First is the divine hearing. So this is a person who awakens to the divine hearing, and now all the current physical hearings are seen in terms of the divine hearing. All sounds, all voices have become thy voice. Music and thunder and the cry of birds, life babbling of her sorrows and her joys, cadence of human speech and murmured words. The laughter of the sea's enormous mirth, the winged plane purring through silent air, the auto's trumpet song of speed to earth, the machine's reluctant drone, the siren's blare, blowing upon the windy horn of space, a call of distance and mystery. Memories of sunlit lands and ocean ways, all now are wonder tones and themes of thee. A secret harmony smites through the blind heart, and all grows beautiful because thou art. You see, he gives you all these wonderful music, thunder, cry of birds, life's sorrows and joys, human speech, and then including also the winged plane purring, the auto's trumpet song. You see the horn which you go, ouch, it hurts so much when they blare. Auto's trumpet song of speed to earth. You see, to this hearing, it is the auto which is trumpeting a song of speed, telling the earth, I'm coming, I'm moving fast, watch out. And the machine's reluctant drone, it doesn't like to be driven, it goes on, grong, 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 grong. Reluctantly it is driven. Everything is pushing constantly, and that's the drone. and the blare of the siren. All of these are included in this deeper, subtler harmony which he is perceiving now through the hearing. So when the divine hearing comes, all sounds, right now this babbling of the police on the loudspeakers, all of these are expressing a secret harmony, which to the normal hearing would be chaotic, cacophonic. But to the subtle hearing, there's a secret harmony even in these. So the next is divine sight. And now see, hearing had the character of vibration, intensity, and rhythm. These were the things which were characterized here. In sight, the focus is form. Divine sight. Each sight is now immortal with thy bliss. My soul through the rapt eyes has come to see. A veil is rent, and they no more can miss the miracle of thy world epiphany. So when my soul sees the veil is rent, nothing can be missed out. Everything is thy bliss. Into an ecstasy of vision caught, each natural object is of thee a part. A rapture symbol from thy substance wrought, a poem shaped in beauty's living heart. So not only is each object a part of the divine consciousness, but it is formed of the substance of the divine as a symbol expressing something of the divine consciousness, but a rapturous symbol. And each is a poem shaped in beauty's living heart. And one cannot speak of this, one has only to feel it. The living heart of beauty expressing itself in poetry. Each shape is like that. Then, a masterwork of color and design, a mighty sweetness borne on grandire's wings. A burdened wonder of significant line reveals itself in even commonest things. All forms are thy dream dialect of delight, O absolute, O vivid, infinite. So even one line, significant line, carries the wonder of burden of the divine consciousness, even in the commonest things. And finally, the third, divine sense. Surely I take no more an earthly food, but eat the fruits and plants of paradise. For thou hast changed my senses' habitude from mortal pleasure to divine surprise. Hearing and sight are now an ecstasy, and all the fragrances of earth disclose a sweetness matching in intensity odor and crimson marvel of the rose. Every sense is of that same character. In every contact's deep invading thrill that lasts as if its source were infinite, I feel thy touch. Thy bliss imperishable is crowded into that moment of delight. The body burns with thy rapture's sacred fire, pure, passionate, holy, virgin of desire. Each of the five senses have been listed here, but in particular you note when there is a contact, you reach out and touch the flower. Deep invading thrill, as if the whole universe surges through and the divine bliss comes through that point of contact that lasts as if its source were infinite. At this moment I touch the flower as if it was infinity which is coming through, and it lasts as if it is infinite and the source is infinite. Although it is a momentary touch, you're touching infinity and the impact has the character of infinite. I feel thy touch. It is as if the divine were to touch and you are touching the divine. And the bliss imperishable of the entire divine is crowded into that moment of delight. You touch briefly the rose's rose petal, and that whole imperishable bliss of the entire divine is crowded into that moment. So you see this play of eternity, infinity, all in that one moment, but all with the divine bliss bursting out. And imagine now, as you walk through the forest, your feet, each step touches infinity, eternity of the divine bliss bursting through. Your eyes, each perception, divine infinite bliss bursting through. Your fingers, and a thorn perhaps briefly cuts your flesh, and it is that infinite bliss in a very special contact. And each of the senses thus. What happens to the body? The body burns with thy rapture's sacred fire. Intensity of that. Pure, passionate, holy, virgin of desire. There's no desire left. There is only the purity. Mortal pleasure has changed to divine surprise. Everything is a surprise of perception of divine sense. I would encourage you to read all three and dwell upon these. They're all compiled in the sonnets. And we can meditate on this for a few minutes.